Thank you very much, Josabel, and welcome everybody to the Jus Laboris webinar on top performing countries in fighting COVID. I know some of you will have read the report, but others won't. So what I'd like to do to start is just briefly introduce the report, which is what this discussion is all about. The report was jointly authored by Jus Laboris and the ADECO group and presented to the World Economic Forum in Davos. There are two preliminary matters that I think need to be highlighted to understand the report and share its thrust. As is patently clear from the title, the report aims to identify policies which have been successful in reducing the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on communities and particularly on business. And the report has two groups of indicators, fiscal and health, and it measures those across two timelines. Turning to each of those indicators, and the first one obviously is health. The health impact of the pandemic was measured using the numbers of deaths per capita, the number of cases per capita, vaccination speed, the full vaccination rate, and partial vaccination rate. The economic indicator was measured using the percentage change to GDP, the unemployment rate, the employment rate, stock market indices, the consumer confidence index, and the business confidence index. I said there were two timelines. The first timeline considers the country performance since the beginning of the pandemic, which was, say, January 2020 to October 2021. And the second timeline is how well the government's recovered since the peaks of the crisis in terms of GDP, and that's July 2020 to October 2020. So that's the thrust of the report. What were the results? Well, in today's seminar, you have representatives from the top performing states that you see on the slide now, including South Korea, Singapore, Australia, and even my own country, New Zealand. The graph you can see shows the overall responses to the pandemic, and the top three spots are South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. When we consider the states' responses since the peak of the pandemic, it's important to look at the ability to recover. And in that, there is a change. We find that Singapore and Canada take the lead, while South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand fall behind. Interestingly, you'll notice in each of these states, bar Canada, are island-based. When you think about it, an island probably makes it easier to manage, or a peninsula in the case of South Korea. Our guest speakers, no doubt, will speak about how a great role their nation being an island state played in the response. From my own experience, I can tell you that a core part of New Zealand's response, keeping out COVID, really was the fact it was an island, particularly up to including the past couple of weeks. But an exception to that rule, of course, is the United Kingdom, which, despite being an island nation, performed much worse across both the economic and health indicators. So what were the takeaways? Well, there were 4 policy recommendations, which each of our panelists will discuss in respect of their own countries. The first is protecting the people and countries making an effort to protect health. Those ones tended to see better economic recovery, with one exception, Sweden. And of course, they had a different policy, and they concentrated on consumer and business confidence indexes rather than lockdown strategies. If you look at the second graph below, an interesting insight, to me anyway, is that protecting the community leads to better outcomes in both indices. So doing so with overly stringent measures does not necessarily lead to better outcomes. The second takeaway, I think, is maintaining support. Government spending on recovery has led to good microeconomic indicators. The third takeaway, and I think that this is something particularly interesting to those involved in employment law and employment issues, is that the pandemic has forced businesses to make changes that might have been in the pipeline for some time. Remote and flexible co-working are perhaps the 2 best examples. So if I'm right there, perhaps the pandemic remains an opportunity. The final point I make is that the issue now is how to prepare or set the regulatory framework to go back to normal, whatever that might be. So that's what we're here to discuss today, as much looking forwards as backwards. I now will ask each of the panelists to make their observations and comments. Our first panelist is going to be Desmond Wee from Singapore. Desmond heads up, amongst other things, the employment and labour section of his firm at Rajan and Tan, a large practice. Desmond himself is a graduate of the University of Nottingham, and he is a solicitor and advocate in the Supreme Court of Singapore. Desmond.
Thank you very much, Peter. A very good afternoon, good evening, and to some of you, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be able to share with you some of my insights in relation to this report that has been prepared together with ADECO and the Youth Laborers Group. If you look at the first slide, the one thing that you would, and this relates back to what Peter had given, the starting synopsis, where the report had looked at how states have performed within 2 timelines. Firstly, would be throughout the course of the pandemic, where Korea, Australia, and New Zealand have certainly done well. And in the recovery stage, and again, Peter did mention the timelines that we were kind of looking at the recovery stage would have been July 2020 to October 2021. So right in the middle of 2020 and the entire range of 2021. And in that recovery stage, the quote from the ADECO report, where it said that we've mastered the recovery and had a strong economic upsurge with relatively low numbers. So that's what the report said. So the first thing I would say that for those of you who are familiar with Singapore, you will know that our national hobby is really to try to be first in everything. So it is with some relief that we got a top spot in one of the factors. If not, I wouldn't have volunteered to speak on this. But the reality is that when you look at how Singapore did it, it's interesting, and I would certainly want to share some of my perspectives, which really can act as a counterfoil to some of the jurisdictions. And certainly I will also make a few points that this is not a model, or the actions that we've taken, it's not necessarily something that may fit to many countries. So really, to give a clear perspective in terms of that mastering of the recovery, and if I put some numbers to it, you will see on the slide, on full year GDP 2020, there was a contraction of 4.1%. And that is the worst full year recession for us since independence in 1965. And certainly the causal effects of the pandemic was that direct cause. You had supply demand shock in relation to the various industries. We essentially had travel restrictions, and Peter alluded to this situation where, as an island state, locking up our borders to the extent gave us that extra time to deal with the onslaught of the cases that were spreading then in early 2020, and allowed us to in a sense transform with a little bit of lag time behind it. And we had a lockdown. I would call it a partial lockdown from April to June 2020. We didn't want to call it a lockdown. We called it a circuit breaker, for what it's worth. And I think the connotations on that would be clear as I talk about later in terms of the issue of the effectiveness of the stringency of the measures. So when you compare that to 2021, where we had a full year GDP growth expansion of 7.6%, that kind of lends credence and support in relation to the data that the report had done. In terms of the expansion of GDP in 2021, it was led typically by a lot of the traditional industries that Singapore has been strong over the various decades. This will include manufacturing, construction, wholesale trade, aviation, and financial services. Singapore, having modeled ourselves as a hub a lot for access into the rest of Southeast Asia and to larger Asia, that certainly was one of our priorities. Of course, like many other countries, hospitality, the hotel business, food and beverage, that still remains at best on a even keel. There has been some fluctuations depending on the various movements of the safety measures, but by and large, if you take the pulse on the street in Singapore, there seems to be a general consensus that it is really it's come back to the pre-pandemic levels in relation to economic activity. And now it's the usual worry of external factors, Ukraine, different other demands from the global economy that's concerning the policymakers rather than COVID being that key and primary issue. So what did we do right? Again, for those of you who are familiar with the report, you would see that they look at it from two large aspects, the social aspects. Sorry, Joseph, can you just go back to the first, from two aspects, the social aspects and the economic aspects. And I thought that I'll share a little bit with all of you in terms from within these two perspectives as well. From the social aspects, I think one of the key indicators, or at least one of the key measures I felt kind of gave us the additional time and ability to manage the pandemic a little better. It was an early implementation of many of the sanitary protocols, which on top of the implementation, it was then enshrined in law. Singapore passed the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act as early as March 2020, and that still remains in force. So again, those of you who are very familiar with Singapore, we support these measures with robust, and that's a very polite word, with very robust enforcement processes. So you will have people wearing red with little badges called safe distance ambassadors. in the early days, and I believe to a larger extent still going on. They'll be walking around in offices, they'll come and raid your offices with tape measures and figure out whether you've complied with the 2-meter rule. And they'll make people sit down and then they'll measure. And if you don't comply, then it's an offense under the act. So those are the kind of things, the robust enforcement of the law. Secondly, you see that I put a slow and gradual relaxation of control measures. That's a pro as well as a con. Singapore still remains very much within current environment where there's quite a lot of measures. Those of you all who are closer to my age will remember Janet Jackson's song, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And that is really how we're feeling at the moment. It's a slow and gradual relaxation. It is not a big bang. And from some aspects, people see that also has helped us in terms of managing it. Early engagement with the pharmaceuticals. We're the first Asian country to get the Pfizer vaccine. In terms of vaccination rates, in terms of booster rates, very similar to Australia, but it is up there in comparison to many of the developed countries. From the economic perspective, and again, Peter referred to this in one of his points, where substantive targeted financial support was what we felt was really key in terms of trying to sustain and protect the economy. So again, unprecedented in 2020, a total of 4 budgets, where essentially the Singapore government spent close to 100 billion from our reserves. The last time we used our reserves, and even then that was by no means near that this $100 billion figure would have been in the financial crisis, and that was literally 1/3 of it. Very quickly, specific laws, we implemented new laws to allow people to fail quickly. We changed some of our insolvency laws, which allowed people to pivot so as not to drag on. And that was a point about transformation of the economy. And finally, as a little nation state where we relied a lot of movement of human capital and movement of trade, we made sure that as soon as we could, we started opening up air bubbles. In fact, the first air bubble came about, our first case in Singapore was discovered in January 2020, and our air bubble came about in May 2020. Josabel, next slide, please. So why did it work? I'm just gonna go through very quickly. First one, from my perspective, it's trust. Some people may call it deference, while others may call it deference. It's in a sense that codependency, that social compact that typically the Singapore population would have had with the Singapore government, where the reliance on the guidance from Singapore, from the government, has been in existence for so many decades, that the policies that it came out with, there was a whole of country effort to pull together to achieve those perspectives. You will see I have that little political interference, little obstruction. So from that perspective, it was a very smooth implementation of the many policies, and public messaging, very clear, unequivocal focus and messaging probably helped transform or help convey those kind of messages that the government was trying to do so. Now, it's not everything good. We are seeing some downsides, and if you look at it from the business perspective, from the employment perspective, there has been a large outflow of foreign talent and a much slower pace of replacement. So as we gather up for the recovery and getting back to normal economic activity, this is a space that's a little bit concerning, where a lot of the foreign talent has left for whatever reason, social or economic, and the pace of replacement has been much slower. And certainly mental wellness, when you look at it from a typical Asian workforce perspective, up until 5 years ago, mental wellness would really simply be, did you have 1 hour of sleep at night, or did you manage to catch 3 hours of sleep? But really now this has really been brought to the forefront, and it's something that a lot of the employers do need to deal with. Finally, dealing with Omicron, the whole situation has changed, as with many countries. We are dealing with a different strategy where we're living with the pandemic, but economic recovery continues in Singapore. Thanks, Peter. Peter, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Desmond, for that analysis from Singapore. I'd now like to introduce John Tuck from Australia. John is the head of CORE's employment law team, a very experienced practitioners and one of the leading advisors, Monash University graduate. But I see John also on the advisory boards at University of Melbourne Law School, Centre for Employment Industrial Relations. Australia, very important in the region. Melbourne and Victoria very much in the news at the time. So we're interested to hear your perspective.
Yes, I come to you from the most lockdown city in the world, Peter, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. Australia, as a very large country, has had a number of different perspectives on the last 2 years about what it's been like to live with COVID. Australia shut its borders almost 2 years ago. And as you indicated at the beginning, Peter, being an island, there are some natural advantages in preserving and protecting both your people and your economy, if that's what you are. Australia's had other advantages that particularly by the fact that Western Australia and Queensland have had very good pandemics in a sense, because for the vast majority of the time they've been open economies, free of COVID, and being able to continue to operate without any disruption. And the evidence of both those states is that they have had booming economies for the last 2 years. They have unemployment rates below 4%, which is very, very low for Australia. And it is quite a remarkable effort. And the resources economy, whether it's gas, iron ore, or coal, have had incredible years, very high prices, and they continue to be very high now with the events in Europe. So we've had some very useful natural advantages, and to the credit of governments, state and federal, they have taken advantage of that in Australia. Closing the borders was a really important step that we took 2 years ago. The other thing that I think was really critical at the time, because there were lockdowns in Sydney and in Melbourne, the two largest cities in Australia, there was a government scheme called JobKeeper, and that did and has proven to have had a significant effect. It was a $100 billion plus scheme. It provided 6 months of financial support to businesses who expected their revenues to drop. And this was introduced in March of 2020. And it was done you could access it on the basis if you said you anticipated your business revenues to drop over the next 6 months. And as we entered the pandemic, you'll recall that most people were very, very uncertain as to what would happen. I know as a partner of my law firm, we had no idea what revenues we would have. We thought they could go down significantly. It's proven to be the case in most law firms probably around the world that they've all gone up significantly. But at the time, all businesses were very anxious about what would happen. And so we designed a scheme that was easy to understand, easy to get money, easy to get the money into business and household balance sheets. And it was most importantly designed to give recipients certainty in times of great uncertainty. And that had and did preserve jobs. and it is the singular decision of the government that really has underpinned the economic performance of Australia, which when we've come out of lockdown has been very, very strong. Now, Sydney and Melbourne have fluctuated in and out of lockdown, and Melbourne has had, on record, I think the longest lockdown city in the world. But the benefits around us have been significant, and every time Melbourne's come out of one of its 6 lockdowns, the economy has rapidly bounced back. And so as we sit here today, the economic performance in Australia is very, very strong, and the outlook is very, very strong. And the other key thing on a social perspective, and our government is being criticised heavily in Australia for being too slow because we didn't prioritise vaccinations or getting access to vaccines probably as aggressively as others. And one of the reasons probably was, and this might have been the right thing to do anyway, but certainly not the perspective Australians have, is that most of Australia was not in lockdown. And so like New Zealand, people were living normal-ish lives without any exposure to various viruses. And so the idea that you had to prioritise vaccinations was not really something that everyone necessarily paid enough attention to. When the Omicron variant arrived in Australia back in August last year, people got very agitated that we didn't have access to vaccines because it became obvious that you couldn't eliminate it. Certainly couldn't eliminate it in cities like Sydney and Melbourne without taking steps that no government in Australia would be able to enforce. So the vaccination rates have really allowed Australia now to pretty much live in a relatively normal way. And the vaccination rates are something like 96% of Australians over 12 have had at least 1 shot, 94% have had 2, and we're closing in on 60% have had 3. That has meant that when all restrictions came off, and they started to come off in December last year, it meant in Sydney and Melbourne, it has meant that our hospital system has not been overrun despite the very large numbers in Australia. Since the report was published, Australia has had Omicron and we've had very large numbers. But notwithstanding that, the underlying issues about performance are probably still ring true because our economy has started to bounce back. And the issue around vaccination rates being so high, even though there's been a lot of noise around mandates, realities in Australia with 96% of people have had a shot, the vast majority of people have clearly decided that it was a good idea to do. Now, the government supported at our state level mandates that drove numbers up, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. And then it was really like a carrot and stick approach. So the government really put restrictions on what you could do and where you could go, and you were required to get a vaccine. So having driven the numbers up to very high levels, it means that the Omicron variant, even though it is now freely circulating through the cities, it hasn't overwhelmed the hospital system. And the coronavirus as a news item has dropped from the front pages. It's no longer leading all the stories. And there's now the push and the focus very much is, well, how do you return people to the office? And do you continue vaccine mandates? In circumstances where the government is very bullish on the economy, it remains bullish notwithstanding what's happening in Europe. Unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, we have a lot of gas. I know that there's real efforts to use any excess gas and send it to Europe to replace Russian gas. We have lots of wheat. Again, the Ukrainian wheat and agricultural products. I mean, these are opportunities, and Australia doesn't do much trade with Russia. So, we still have a very optimistic country in terms of the economy, notwithstanding the very upsetting things happening in Europe. and of course the natural disasters that we're currently befalling Queensland and New South Wales and Australia at the moment, which are devastating, particularly in Queensland. But the issues, Peter, really are going back to can we continue to mandate vaccinations? But when you got to 95%, there's a real question mark around the necessity of that, and there's a debate that will happen. And then there's returning to the office, and that's starting to happen with great gusto across Australian cities as of this week, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. I'll leave it there, Peter.
Thank you. As I've said, having you from Melbourne, which I wasn't going to say the most lockdown city, but in terms of stringency, and I'm going to have a question later, John, for you. I think that prompted me as to whether stringency is the answer in the Omicron age. But before we get to questions, the third case study are our friends in South Korea. And this is going to be a tandem presentation by Soo'jung Lee from Yulchon LLC, one of South Korea's largest law firms, a full service firm. Soo'jung, very experienced in employment law. I see, Soo'jung, apart from your Korean university, you're actually also a graduate from Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. And you're going to be joined by Chris Mandel, your colleague, a foreign attorney, University of Pennsylvania Law School, and Chris, interestingly, the American University of Paris, but we'd prefer you to keep your presentation in English. So thank you for the Yulchon team. Who's going to go first, Chris or Soo'jung?
I'll take it from here. Thank you very much, Peter, for your kind introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Soo'jung Lee. I'm heading the international employment practice at Yulchon, a Korean law firm in Seoul. Me and my colleague Chris are very happy to be here to present Korea, which has received the highest award, if you say so. I'll first speak about the findings from the Davos report itself, and then Chris will continue the discussion focusing on what has changed since, as the report was prepared based on the data researched back in October last year, and things have changed dramatically since. In the first slide, it is the quote from the report itself. It says, and I'm not reading from this quote, South Korea appears to have the most effective strategy to respond to the pandemic, both in terms of economic and health indicators, followed by Australia and New Zealand. Those countries were able to avoid a surge in deaths and cases without affecting economic activity, while the South Korean government has only spent 6.4% of its GDP since January 2020 in fiscal measures aimed at mitigating the effects of the pandemic, making it the third most frugal country. It has used a wide range of economic policies and provided support to both business and workers. Businesses were able to obtain low-interest loans, were granted subsidies to cover their business costs, and were able to avail themselves of short-term work compensation schemes. Workers have seen their access to sick pay eased, and application process for unemployment benefits simplified. Moreover, financial support has been made available both in the form of low-interest loans for low-income individuals and direct subsidies. Finally, unlike other countries, some of those support measures are still in place, like a deferred tax payment, which was announced just 2 days ago by our tax authority. So how did Korea do that? How did we do that? In reality, unlike many other countries, we never really had any major lockdown in the country. So that may sound very interesting to you. Yes, cafes and restaurants were closed at 9 or 10 p.m., not during the daytime, just a little earlier than usual. And big gatherings, like more than 7 people, more than 6 people, those were not allowed. But weddings continued, funerals continued, people went to sports, people went to cafes, people went to restaurants, and people traveled locally without much of restrictions. So basically, life continued with normalcy as much as it could. And you heard that government spent only 6.8%, the third most frugal country in those 20 countries that were surveyed. So what were then the potential factors in the success of Korea's measures in containing the pandemic? I heard Desmond saying that there was some trust to the government, and I'm not really sure whether we can say that about the Korean government, because we have a national election coming up, a presidential election coming up just next week. So there was a lot of debate and controversies and criticism over what the government has been doing. But if I give you some of the answers that I could find myself or from other resources, most measures that were initiated by the authorities were fully implemented and compliance was high. There were relatively little conflict and controversy over things like vaccine mandates, masking requirements, and very, very invasive or intrusive testing and tracing. Just a few weeks ago, if you went to a restaurant, you would have to open your cell phone and show your QR code to check in for contact tracing and vaccine pass. And people just did it without asking or without really resisting, just people did it. And there were rare but genuine punishments meted out for violations. So in other places where there has been enormous resistance to pandemic control measures, I could suspect that things were not enforced stringently. So that might have been one of the causes. Some people attribute high compliance to social cohesion, or perhaps people adapt to changes more easily because of the unique geographical location. Peter mentioned that Korea being a peninsula might have done something about it. And I realized that we have North Korea closed down there. So we actually have only seas open. Our access to the land is closed. But Korean government was criticized heavily by its people for allowing foreigners continue to come, even in the early area of Wuhan virus season. So that may not have done much. We can't really say whether those suspicion or that the people calling that high social cohesion factor is true or not. But it also seems relevant that Koreans are used to wearing masks in general, because many do so when air quality is very bad. And we had experience of dealing with SARS or MERS in the past. So this, even though it wasn't really a universal global level pandemic like COVID, people have seen and were scared before of the effect from the infectious disease, and that may help as well. And Chris, you will please continue our discussion on the present and future.
Sure, thanks, Soo'jung, and hello, everyone. So after all that talk about Korea's successes and how well we've done, I get to talk about how cases are through the roof now, as a sort of postscript, how things are doing now. And we're experiencing something a lot like what John described with respect to Australia not long ago, which is that we're going through an Omicron wave in Korea, and cases are very high. In fact, Korea experienced over 200,000 cases on March 2nd, which was a record. And in fact, you're looking at one of them. I'm home isolating with COVID now, and my whole family is too. So this is in sharp contrast to early in the pandemic, when people would lose their minds if the case level went over 100 in a day. It's a totally different picture. However, I don't think this at all negates the success of Korea's early approach to COVID. What Korea managed to accomplish was that it delayed this kind of rapid spread until virtually everybody had been vaccinated. So the vaccination rate in Korea is very high. Basically, almost everybody other than children who didn't have an available vaccine until very recently has been vaccinated, at least with the initial shots. And the booster rate is pretty high and climbing as well. So through its masking, tracing, and testing, and those other interventions that Korea used early on, it was able to keep the spread very low until people were essentially ready to face what we're facing now. So Korea hasn't seen anywhere near the level of death that some other countries have unfortunately suffered. The total deaths from the COVID pandemic are still under 10,000 from the beginning of the pandemic, which I think is less than 100th of what the US has faced, for example. And the US is only about 6 times the size of Korea. So it's quite a big difference. And hopefully that will stay low even in the future. So even in the face of this Omicron wave and the significantly increased case levels, so far the government is not reversing course on opening up. It's not reimposing very stringent restrictions. As Soo'jung mentioned, we never had real large-scale lockdowns. There were restrictions, and there still are. Those are being loosened up. And I think the desire of many people is to trust in the vaccines and in the supposed lesser virulence of Omicron, and to move back towards normal and keep moving in that direction. So, for example, the government is moderately adjusting as things progress. They recently had pared back some of the loosened restrictions on entry into Korea. So it's a bit harder to get a quarantine exemption now. But also they're essentially abandoning the vaccine pass that had been in place and used to sort of go anywhere. And so that ubiquitous barcode scanner process to enter almost any restaurant or cafe or any kind of establishment in Korea is kind of going away now. And basically everybody who can be vaccinated has been by this point. Not everybody, but quite close. And it's mostly at this point just children, young children who haven't been. Whether there's any big reversal will depend, I think, on how things go with regard to severe cases and deaths. Despite high case levels, as I said, the level of death is currently so bearable. And as long as the hospitals aren't overwhelmed and deaths don't go up too high, we'll probably continue to keep opening up and loosening those restrictions. And as Soo'jung mentioned, there's an election where the pandemic is one of the major issues, but I don't think it's a sort of overwhelmingly dominant issue, as it might have been if there were an election, halfway through the pandemic, right? Now it's an issue among a bunch of issues that the parties are debating and arguing about. Ironically, some are predicting that we may hit the Omicron peak on election day. As people line up to vote, that's something that they can bear in mind. I'm sure they'll all be socially distancing. On the economic side, Korea has still maintained some of its modest fiscal efforts. As the report made clear, and as Soo'jung discussed, Korea's outlays in this regard were not as high as some other countries. Despite that, Korea's economic performance was quite good. I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that you can't really divide the economy and the pandemic, right? if you have a lot of people getting sick and dying, inevitably that's going to have a major effect on the economy, and having less of that is naturally going to allow for a more relaxed fiscal response because there's less economic harm to mitigate. And there are also some legal barriers in Korea to quickly pulling back in terms of business and investment. For example, some of you may be familiar with the fact that Korea makes it very difficult to terminate people or do redundancies. So you can't just quickly downsize. And some of the economic support that Korea put in place was actually making more available some of the subsidies it already had for retaining workers rather than downsizing. So yeah, that's all for me, and wish us luck getting over this wave, and I wish you all good health as well.
Thank you, Chris and Soo'jung. As I intimated, I thought one of the fascinating conclusions of the report is that stringency wasn't necessarily an indicator of success. Now we're, as different countries of different stages of Omicron. Chris, New Zealand hasn't hit the peak of the Omicron wave. What's the learning lessons, though? If we look at the report, what change in approach do you expect or hope to see? John, I was fascinated by your answer when you said that whether it's the state government or the federal government, I don't know, was now embarking on a program of trying to get people back to the office and the workplace.
Yeah, very much so, Peter. And this is a state government-run thing, but it's basically a coordinated position across Australia to get people back into the cities. People have been back at work pretty much since December, and of course, people have been working home all the way through. But the big push now is to get our CBDs back. Sydney and Melbourne have both been through the Omicron wave, and so that's coming way on the downside of that wave now in those two cities. And the push really is around, is it a reasonable and lawful direction to require people to come back to work? There's some tension around that anyway, because our unemployment rates are low because we haven't had anyone coming into Australia. We're finding it hard to find staff in a lot of areas. And that's probably right throughout businesses. So businesses don't want to lose staff. They're worried they're going to lose them anyway. So there's that balance of the welfare of people. Having asked people to work from home at a drop of a hat 2 years ago, can you just all simply require them all to come back to work? And should you give some respect to the efforts that they made, and allow them some flexibility around that? Some employers have been very blunt. You're coming back to the office, we want you back now. But most, certainly white collar employers, are treading carefully in the space, thinking that some flexibility is a good thing, but also recognizing that the ability to see people and interact and have human connections and that social aspect of work is returned. And so we're in that balance now of doing so. The big lesson really is around vaccination rates. Australia has embraced those vaccinations. They have clearly had the ability to preserve the hospital system, and because the people have, are seeing the results, there's a level of confidence about people moving around. And we've dropped mask mandates except for public transport and essentially, and for hospital settings. Otherwise, you don't have to wear a mask at work. A lot of the restrictions are really being removed. And our football season, Peter, will kick off in 2 weeks' time, and there'll be 90,000 people at the football, and that's the world we're in. So it's shifting very quickly, and people are hopeful, and I think employers are hopeful that they can start to move beyond this as the biggest issue that we're dealing with.
That's absolutely fascinating, John. Desmond, Singapore was the world leader initially in the first third of 2020. What change in approach do you think now? What are you seeing there? What's different?
Thanks, Peter. Yes, the approach is different. In a sense, as I hear John and Soo'jung and Chris talk about their experiences, certainly from the Singapore perspective, we've had very similar experiences in terms of the kind of measures. I did hear from Soo'jung and Chris in relation to there not having been a lockdown. In Singapore, I mentioned earlier, we had a circuit breaker, where essentially it wasn't really a lockdown. It's very similar to South Korea, except that we didn't have in-person dining. Most of the F&B was still open, but it was really for takeaway. So economic activity continued, and that together with the social controls, the safe distance, all those things were there. And that, as I mentioned earlier, again, it kind of gave us a little leeway, a little headroom in terms of managing the healthcare system. With the loosening of the measures after June 2020, we kind of had our peaks and troughs. When cases on the second, on the third wave, when Delta came, we reimposed some of the social distancing measures. We got the people back to office for short periods of time, 2-3 weeks, but we never really went back into that lockdown. And really since that time, from June 2020 up until now, it has been more or less that consistency in relation to the measures. We haven't really changed much. We still have a restriction in terms of social interaction, no more than five when you're eating out. So to me, as Omicron came, and even for us, we don't see that the Omicron peak has come yet. In fact, it's yesterday we just saw our highest number of cases at 24,000 cases. But like Chris said, in the early days when it was really kind of like a sport to guess the numbers the next day, now nobody even blinks an eye and they go, okay, yep, 24,000, that's great. And the difference is this: whilst we continue with these measures, and yet the Omicron strategy, the Singapore government is always saying that you live with it. I think the problem, we are feeling it harder where Singapore relies so much on international trade, on having those open borders. I think it is very much a challenge now, Peter, and getting people back to the office is very similar to what John has shared. You have two groups of thinking. One is you really need to get back to the office. I don't care, I need you there. And some of the larger organizations who then feel that there needs to be a level of recognition in terms of what is the new normal. So to me, when you look at this current Omicron wave, short answer, I would say that Singapore law perspective, we are trying to handle it again in a very slow and gradual manner. But personally, I think it's a little slow. And as the rest of the world advances, we really need to watch what's going on around us. If not, we'll be left behind.
Thank you, Desmond. Chris or Soo'jung, who's going to answer that point about Omicron and the new world? Chris.
I'll jump in. I think it's interesting to look at that point you made about stringency and effectiveness, right? I think one of the key things about how Korea was able to make it to this point with a relatively low cost to the economy and to people's lives is that they effectively kept cases low from the beginning. And I think that's true of a number of other countries that have done well throughout the pandemic, even without really intense lockdowns or those kinds of measures. Once countries allowed COVID to sort of run rampant, it was hard, I think, to put the genie back in the bottle without some really extreme measures. Whereas in Korea, it was, like I said, people freaked out if cases were over 100 for a long time. and which was abnormal. And so because those early measures were effective at stopping the spread, you never had this kind of rampant spread of COVID that was just sort of unstoppable without really intense interventions into society. Now that we've reached a point here where almost everybody is vaccinated and people are less concerned about the spread of COVID, I think there's just a lot more tolerance now for these really high case numbers that would have had people, boarding up their windows early on in the pandemic. 200,000 would have been unthinkable, and people wouldn't have even left the house. But now it's, if you go to a cafe, it's packed. People aren't hiding away anymore. They're eager, it seems, to go out and trust that the vaccines are going to protect us, and they seem to be so far. And that at some point you have to return to some kind of normalcy, and just accept essentially that this is going to be something that you have a risk of contracting, and if you're vaccinated, the risk isn't necessarily that high to your health and well-being, and life has to go on.
Just to add there, so we have people who have doubts and who have suspicions about the effectiveness of vaccine, and we have those conspiracy theories going on as well. It's not a country where those are just prohibited, but I think in general people were not so objecting to the vaccinations. In general, Korean people do get like flu shots like every year, so it's encouraged, and a lot of them are covered by the national health insurance, so you don't have to pay for it. So I think like people not so much fear of like some injection into your body, didn't feel that much too intrusive. So we had a good vaccination rate. But I heard from like John and Desmond and Peter, our rate is only 86%, but I heard like Australia 95% or something. So
well, but I think he said, Soo'jung, don't be too complimentary to them. I think he said adults it was 96%. Am I right about that?
Over 12.
Right, that's right.
Yeah, over 12.
Right.
Well,
So
we have 2 minutes to go. Did anyone have a point they feel that we hadn't covered? If not, can I please thank the panelists tonight? Can I thank Jus Laboris for arranging this and the logistics of it, and can I thank Adecco for the partnership in preparing this report with the Jus Laboris team.